Welcome to Case in Point, produced by the University of Pennsylvania Law School in collaboration with Bloomberg Law. I'm your host, Felicia Lin. Today we'll be talking about the impacts of President Trump's executive order on immigration. And with us today, we have first Sarah Paoletti, a practiced professor of law and director of the Transnational Legal Clinic here at Penn Law. And joining us from Arlington, Virginia, is Laura Francis, reporter and editor at Bloomberg BNA. All right, Laura, let's start with you. Can you give us a quick overview of the January 27th executive order and talk a little bit about the controversy that it's caused?
Sure. So the January 27th order actually does a number of things in the area of immigration. The first and one of the most well-known is to put a ban on immigrants from 7 named countries for a 90-day period. It's Iran, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, Sudan, Libya, and Yemen. And the other big thing that it does is it temporarily suspends the refugee admissions program for 120 days and suspends admissions of refugees from Syria indefinitely. The order also does a number of other things that are less well known, including instructing the Department of Homeland Security to start working on a new screening process for immigrants along the lines of what President Trump referred to during his campaign as extreme vetting. It also sets up a plan for a biometric entry-exit system for temporary visitors, and it suspends the visa interview waiver program, which applies to temporary immigrants who go to renew their visas abroad. The controversy has centered mostly around the refugee suspension, as well as the ban on the immigrants from the 7 countries. Most notably, over the weekend of January 28th and 29th, there were a lot of protests at airports because people who were en route to the United States at the time that the order was signed wound up getting detained at the airport and not being able to get through. At the time, that also included green card holders. But since that time, Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly had issued a press release saying that in his judgment under the executive order, green card holders could come to the United States. So that's kind of where things stand at the moment, but there's still a lot of uncertainty around what the order is going to mean going into the future.
And Sarah, how does this order fit in the Trump administration's broader approach to immigration?
So I think what we're seeing on immigration and the order from Friday night, from January 27th, was the last of a week of orders, right? And so earlier that Wednesday on January 25th, he issued 2 other executive orders. And, the titles are consistent with his campaign rhetoric. Border security and immigration enforcement provisions was one of those executive orders, and the other enhancing public safety in the interior. And these orders display a zeal for going after immigrants who are in this country who may or may not have lawful status. And I think what we're seeing is a desire to act rapidly, forcefully, and not necessarily with due regard for the immigration law and regulations as they stand, for due process protections, and ensuring the rights of individuals and of families here in this country.
Laura, what's your take on this order's impact on the workforce and maybe more specifically, various sectors of the workforce?
So the workforce in general there's a lot of uncertainty and confusion as to what this means for current employees, both who work in the United States and employees of multinational companies that work abroad. This seems to have mostly impacted high-skill sectors. So we're looking at the tech industry, but there have also been several physicians who have been impacted as well. The confusion relates a lot to the fact that companies tend not to ask where people are from when they're hired. So there's this scrambling to find out, do we have employees that are affected by this order? Where are they? Did they go abroad? Are they planning to go abroad for business or personal reasons? And trying to keep them from being stuck outside the United States for long periods of time. There's uncertainty as to whether this 90-day ban will continue. The temporary nature of the ban is contingent on certain factors, including whether the administration gets enough information from these countries where they feel like they can make a determination that immigrants coming from those countries aren't going to be a threat to the United States. And if they don't get that information in 90 days, then this ban could be even longer. And that has the potential to impact, for example, H-1B temporary visas for skilled workers. Companies are going to need to file the petitions for those visas on April 1st if they want to get those visas for the next fiscal year, which starts on October 1st of this year. And there's a lot of uncertainty over whether, do we go ahead and file the petitions? Will that ban still be in place on October 1st? Or is it just going to go into the void and they're never going to have access to the workers? There's also some concern about whether or not the order is going to get interpreted not just to ban people from coming into the United States if they aren't here already, but whether U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services might stop processing visa applications and other benefits applications for immigrants from those countries who are already here. So that could pertain to extensions of H-1B status for workers who are already here. That is unclear at the moment. So a lot of this is really just rapidly changing, and companies are trying to get a handle on it as best they can.
And Sarah, maybe you could talk a little bit more broadly beyond just workers. What visa programs do you think are likely to be most affected by this order?
So I think that's a hard question to answer because there are multiple ways in which these visa programs are going to be impacted, right? So there's the direct impact. Are there going to be provisions? We are anticipating another executive order to address temporary labor migration programs and visas under that, and we'll see what that looks like. I think as Laura discussed, right, the current ban and suspension of benefits will have a disproportionate impact on those who are here in the tech sector and the H-1B sector, just looking at the labor sector. So that has an impact there. But I think the other piece of this is the uncertainty and chaos that these executive orders have placed. And so for all visa applications and all visa categories, people are wondering, do we file or don't we file? What's the risk of filing? And so I mentioned, the other two provisions, the other two executive orders that were passed prior to the ban that looks at, one of them is increased interior enforcement. And when you have increased interior enforcement, you'll have individuals who are going to be less likely to step forward, right? More likely to go underground. And so is that going to have effect on individuals who may be eligible for cancellation of removal and legal permanent residency as a result of that because they don't file? Is it going to have an impact on individuals who have claims under the Violence Against Women Act for a visa and then might have the possibility for adjusting status? Is it going to have an impact on individuals who are eligible for U visas for victims of certain crime or victims of trafficking? Again, I think for all of those, even though they're not explicitly mentioned in any of the executive orders or explicitly necessarily mentioned in discussions of potential future executive orders, the nature of the action in these executive orders and the way in which they were carried out has left a great level of uncertainty. That means that I think all individuals who are visa holders, who have the eligibility to be visa holders, are in limbo and waiting to find out what this is going to look like and what it means for them and their families.
Laura, Sarah's noting the chaotic and rapid nature of these immigration changes. Is ICE or DHS equipped to handle the pace of these types of changes?
It really is going to depend on what they're expected to do right off the bat. The executive orders do mention that the agencies are going to need to hire a bunch more officers. However, that's going to require appropriations from Congress. At the moment, ICE in particular only has the funding to deport about 400,000 undocumented immigrants per year. And if these executive orders are getting at, the mass deportation that President Trump was talking about on the campaign trail, then they're going to need a lot more money in order to ramp up their personnel and actually be able to do that. I'm not sure with their existing resources that that's going to be the case.
Sarah, what is the scope of undocumented immigration? What does the data say? What is the size of this problem?
So I think that's a really hard question to answer, because I don't think that the law and the way immigration works, just because somebody doesn't have lawful status or documents, doesn't mean that they don't have a right to be present in the country. But the number that's thrown out is there are 11 million undocumented individuals in this country. Of those, many of them may have the opportunity for lawful status, right? They might be eligible for a U visa or a T visa. They might be eligible for asylum. And something that Laura mentioned, there is in the executive order on interior enforcement a move to push and designate asylum services to the border, right? To prevent people from actually getting into the country and being subjected to the full level of judicial review that they'd be entitled to if that application were processed internally. And now, with it being, they're trying to move that processing externally to the border. They're talking about designating asylum officers and immigration judges to the border. Right now, out of the Philadelphia area, you have a 3-year wait for an asylum adjudication at the Newark Asylum Office. If you're taking away resources from that office to border enforcement, you're going to see a longer wait. So would those people count within the illegal immigration population? No, they shouldn't, because they are people who are in process for a lawful status to which they're entitled. So I think that's one issue. In terms of the rest of the undocumented population, taking it outside of those who might be eligible for relief, I think it's also important to remember that individuals are part of families and part of communities, and so the impact on communities is significant. And so the enhancing public safety and the interior provision, which is the executive order designed to go after sanctuary cities or so-called sanctuary cities, is looking at sort of removing the ability of police and local governments to say, this is how we want to police our communities. These are the people who live in our communities. These are the parents who send their kids to school in our communities. And so the impact goes beyond the numbers, and I think it's important to remember where those numbers situate themselves within the system.
Laura, you mentioned that there was obviously a lot of protest when this executive order was first rolled out. What about the political reaction? What are you hearing from either side of the aisle in Washington, D.C.?
So in terms of Congress, so far it appears that the Democrats are pretty uniformly opposed to these executive orders. There have been a couple of bills introduced to try to stop them. And in terms of Republicans, there are some who are on board with the orders. There are some who actually are not. Most notably, Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham came out against the January 27th order. They were in a bipartisan group of senators in 2013 known as the Gang of Eight that got a comprehensive immigration bill through the Senate. So they have a stake in immigration. It's an important issue to them, and I think that they're probably going to put up a fight along with the Democrats in terms of the order. In terms of the agency, that's been a little chaotic as well. The acting Justice Department, head of the Justice Department at the time, Sally Yates, had come out saying that she wasn't going to defend the order in court. There have been a number of legal challenges, and she said she wasn't going to defend it against those legal challenges. She was fired fairly soon afterward and replaced. And now there are some reports that Customs and Border Protection officers are not going along with court orders that said that they can't detain some of the people who are detained at the airports as a result of the order. And so there is some question now, since Sally Yates has been replaced, whether the Justice Department is going to make sure that Customs and Border Protection actually adheres to the court orders. And that's something that's still up in the air and remains to be seen.
Sarah, you mentioned sanctuary cities earlier. What is the impact of this most recent executive order on sanctuary cities and maybe even closer to home sanctuary campuses like here at Penn?
Right. So the January 25th order on enhancing public safety in the interior specifically addresses sanctuary cities. But I think it's important to clarify what a sanctuary city is, right? And so a sanctuary city and a city that's designated themselves a sanctuary city, and the universities that have either designated themselves sanctuary or have been labeled sanctuary because of the statements they've made, are simply saying we're not going to cooperate and carry out the duties of the federal immigration enforcement, right? Our job is not to enforce federal immigration law. That's the rubric of the federal government. If ICE wants to come in and they have a warrant and they want to execute that warrant and do their job, we're not saying we're going to stand in their way. We're just saying we're not going to volunteer that information. And that has been a policy in many cities, and I think we're seeing more cities now come around to that because they recognize the impact of pushing people underground and what that does to their community in terms of safety, security, public health, a whole host of issues in terms of their communities. So what's the impact? I think there's the threat of withholding funding. There is this notion that we will have enforced 287G agreements, which is what existed before these executive orders. It is the cooperation agreement in terms of enforcement of immigration detainers. Cities, I think, are responding in part because of the mass protests in response to the ban, but the other orders, and saying this is not in the interest of our community. Miami, unfortunately, said, well, we're no longer really a sanctuary city and we'll cooperate. And so I think each locality is going to figure out what they're going to do. In terms of campuses, I think campuses still see both the ban, the 7-country ban, suspension of visas for the 7 countries as antithetical to their mission in education and global education and the values of education that they uphold and promote. So I think campuses are trying, university campuses are trying to figure out what do these orders mean for them? What do they mean? I mean, you know, these orders have surpassed all the discussion around the DACA students and the undocumented students on campus, but that is still very much at play, right? What happens to the students who had DACA status, who were eligible for DACA status, for deferred action for child arrivals, and are they going to be able to sustain their livelihood and stay on campuses? And so campuses are trying to figure out what that means, but I think municipalities are pushing back. And then it's a question of whether the states step in, and whether the states will step in support of their municipalities or against, right? Unfortunately, here in Pennsylvania, we've just seen a state bill introduced to punish sanctuary cities. So I think we're going to see how that plays out. It often is talked about in terms of what money is going to be withheld in terms of punishment. But I think municipalities are making the judgment the cost is more than federal dollars. And the cost of policing and the cost of public health and the cost of maintaining a safe and secure community and a community in which we all want to live is greater than the federal dollars that may ultimately be withheld. But I think that's a judgment to be made, and ultimately, again, there are other players involved in withholding federal funding. So I think we're going to see how that plays out over time.
Well, thank you both for joining us for this interesting conversation. Certainly an area we'll be keeping a close watch on. And thank you for joining us on Case in Point.